A young woman has lived on a plantation for years, never imagining that her destiny could change. Everything changes when a millionaire notices something in her that no one has ever perceived. By taking her to another world, secrets begin to emerge about her past. If you like love stories and romance, watch until the end. You won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave your comment saying where you are listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. The sun had not yet risen when Helena was already on her feet, her agile fingers checking the moisture of the earth between the coffee groves. 23 years on that piece of ground had transformed every gesture into pure instinct. She knew every square meter of that property as an extension of her own body. The farm was located in the countryside of Minas Gerais, between Varginha and Tres Pontas, where coffee was more than a plantation. It was a heritage passed down from generation to generation. With her parents aging and her younger brother still finding his place in the world, it was she who carried the weight of keeping everything running. On that March morning, an unexpected pest had attacked part of the crop, and she needed to act fast. She was alone, kneeling among the coffee plants, examining the leaves with patience. Her hands were soiled with earth, her hair tied in a simple ponytail, a silent determination on her face. It was at that moment that Rodrigo Almeida saw her for the first time. He shouldn't have been there. His life unfolded in different environments, meeting rooms in São Paulo, events in the south zone of Rio, international trips. Rodrigo was the heir to a business empire that he knew how to expand. At 36 years old, he had everything money could buy. He was in that region for a negotiation involving agricultural land. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, and he had arrived early. Restless, he took a drive and spotted that modest but impeccably cared-for property. It wasn't love at first sight, not in the romantic way told in sugary stories. It was something else, deeper and more disturbing. Watching Helena work, completely absorbed in what she was doing, Rodrigo felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine humility before something greater than himself. There was a clear connection between that woman and the land she cultivated, a mutual respect that transcended any logical explanation. She wasn't just working, she was in a dialogue with something ancestral. He remained there longer than he intended, leaning against the imported car that clashed completely with the rural landscape. He observed how she moved with precision between the plants, how she touched the earth with care, how she seemed to read signs invisible to anyone else. There was intelligence in those gestures, a wisdom that didn't come from universities or sophisticated books, but from years of attentive observation and practical learning. Helena eventually noticed his presence. She glanced over, saw the luxury car, the man in an impeccable suit completely out of context, and went back to work without giving it much importance. People from the outside appeared in the region from time to time, usually interested in buying land or doing business. It wasn't her problem. She had work to do. But that brief exchange of glances was enough for Rodrigo. He saw something in her eyes, a disconcerting clarity, a total absence of pretension or interest in impressing anyone. She simply existed, authentic and complete, without needing anyone's validation. She was so different from everything he knew, so distant from the women in his social circle, who always seemed to be performing some edited version of themselves. He drove to the business meeting that afternoon, but his mind remained on that plantation. During the following days, even after returning to São Paulo, he couldn't push the image away. It was as if he had seen something fundamental that he had lost long ago, something he didn't even know he was looking for. He returned to the region 2 weeks later, this time without a professional pretext. He made up some excuse for the driver and went straight to that property. He watched from a distance again, feeling ridiculous and at the same time unable to pull away. Helena was there, as always, working. This time she noticed him more clearly and frowned, visibly bothered by the repeated presence of that stranger. On the third visit, she confronted him. She set her tools aside, walked decisively to where he was, and asked directly what he wanted. Her voice was firm, without fear, but also without unnecessary hostility. She simply wanted answers. Rodrigo found himself speechless for the first time in years. How could he explain something he didn't even understand himself? How could he say he was there because she represented something he couldn't name? He ended up being honest in a way that surprised him. He said he had seen her working, that he was impressed by the way she related to the land, that he had never seen anything like it. Helena looked at him with a mixture of incredulity and curiosity. That man clearly didn't belong to that world, but there was something genuine in the way he spoke, an unexpected vulnerability that disarmed any initial defensiveness. They talked for a few minutes right there among the coffee plants. He asked questions about the plantation, about how she learned all of it. She answered directly, without flourishes, explaining processes that were natural to her, but sounded like precious ancestral knowledge to him. The more they talked, the more Rodrigo became convinced that he had found something rare, something that all his money and influence could never buy. It was at that moment that an idea began to form in his mind. It was impulsive, possibly insane, but he couldn't push it away. He needed more time near her. He needed to understand exactly what that woman awakened in him. And accustomed to turning desires into reality, he began to devise a plan. In the following days, Rodrigo returned to São Paulo, but his mind remained occupied. He researched the region, the Silva family property, and Helena. He discovered that she had never left that area, that she had dedicated her entire life to working on the farm, and that she was respected locally for her knowledge of coffee cultivation. He also discovered that the family faced financial difficulties typical of small producers, always on a tightrope between one harvest and the next. The idea that initially seemed impulsive began to take concrete shape. Rodrigo had to go to France for a series of business meetings that would extend for months. He always took a companion to social events, usually women from the same social circle, sophisticated and familiar with that world. But this time he wanted something different. He wanted authenticity. He wanted Helena. He knew he needed to structure the proposal properly, that he couldn't just show up and make an absurd invitation. So he planned carefully. He would offer a real opportunity with concrete guarantees, something that could benefit both her and her family. It wouldn't be charity. It would be a genuine exchange. He returned to the farm on an April morning, this time with a formal proposal. He asked to speak with Helena in private, and when they were seated on the simple porch of the family home, he explained everything. He said he needed to travel to France for approximately 6 months, that he would have various social and professional commitments, and that he would like her to accompany him. He offered a generous sum that would be deposited in advance to ensure her family's stability during her absence. He would cover all her expenses, provide documentation, and everything else necessary. In exchange, he asked only for her presence by his side at events and dinners, her genuine company. Helena listened to him in absolute silence, her face indecipherable. When he finished, she remained silent for long minutes. Rodrigo began to think he had made a terrible mistake, that he had offended her in some way. But then she spoke, and the answer was neither yes nor no. It was a series of direct, practical, intelligent questions. She wanted to know exactly what would be expected of her, what her rights would be, how the arrangements would work, and what would happen if she wanted to return early. There was no naivety in her words, only the shrewdness of someone who had learned early on to protect what was important. Rodrigo answered everything with honesty. He said she would be free to return whenever she wanted, that there would be no obligations beyond public appearances, and that her family would be financially protected regardless of what happened. The more they spoke, the more he realized that she wasn't dazzled by the proposal. She was evaluating, weighing consequences, thinking of the people who depended on her. Helena asked for time to think. 3 days later, she gave her answer. She accepted, but on her own conditions. She wanted a formal contract with all guarantees in writing. She wanted to be able to maintain regular contact with her family, and she wanted part of the money to be used for specific improvements on the farm that she would supervise herself before leaving. And she made it clear that she would go as herself, without pretensions of transforming into something she was not. Rodrigo accepted everything without hesitation, which paradoxically increased her suspicion. Why would someone so powerful agree so easily to conditions imposed by her? But there was something in the way he looked at her, a vulnerability that didn't match the image of a ruthless businessman, which made her want to believe that it was real. In the days leading up to the trip, Helena organized everything meticulously. She trained her younger brother to take on responsibilities that were previously exclusively hers. ensured that her parents would have all the necessary support, and documented every important process of the plantation. She wasn't abandoning her life, she was just pausing it to live something she never imagined possible. When the day of departure finally arrived, she was on the porch at dawn, looking for the last time at that view she knew by heart. The coffee was beginning to bloom again, small white flowers announcing the next harvest. She touched the worn wood of the fence, felt the familiar texture under her fingers, and took a deep breath of that air that had always been hers. Rodrigo arrived punctually, saw her standing there, and for the first time since it all began, he felt a pang of guilt. He was taking her from the only world she knew, bringing her into a completely strange universe. But when she turned and walked toward him with that quiet determination that fascinated him so much, he knew Helena wasn't the type who needed to be protected. She knew exactly what she was doing. They got into the car, and as they drove away from the farm, Helena looked through the rearview mirror until the house disappeared completely around the bend of the road. She didn't cry. She showed no regret. She simply recorded that moment, stored it carefully in her memory, and then turned her gaze forward toward the unknown that awaited her. Rodrigo observed her discreetly, trying to decipher what was going on in her head. He had taken everything so far based on an intuition that even he didn't fully understand. Now, with her there by his side, heading toward an international airport and then to another continent, he began to realize the magnitude of what he had set in motion. Neither of them imagined how much that decision would transform both their lives in ways they could never predict. The flight lasted more than 11 hours. Helena spent much of it watching the world below change. She had never been on a plane, let alone in first class. Rodrigo noticed her silent wonder, but let her process everything at her own pace. During the flight, they talked more than before. He told her about Paris, about the routine that awaited them. She asked practical questions about what would be expected of her. Rodrigo was honest in saying there would be uncomfortable moments and judgmental looks. When the plane descended over Paris, Helena saw through the window that city she had read about in books. The lights created a luminous mosaic. It was a different beauty from what she knew. It didn't have the green immensity of the plantations. It was a built, planned beauty. The apartment Rodrigo kept in Paris was in the 16th arrondissement, on a tree-lined avenue where every building seemed to have centuries of history in its walls. The building was discreet on the outside, but the interior revealed a restrained luxury, an elegance that didn't need to shout to be noticed. The apartment occupied the entire top floor, with wide windows offering a view of the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Helena entered carrying only a small suitcase. Her belongings fit easily into a space that seemed designed to house much more. Rodrigo showed her the rooms, explained how everything worked, and then took her to the room that would be hers. It was larger than the entire house where she grew up, decorated in neutral tones with touches of discreet gold, a huge bed in the center, and a private bathroom that looked like it came out of a decor magazine. He left her alone to settle in, and Helena finally allowed the reality of what was happening to hit her completely. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands still with marks of soil under the nails despite having washed them several times, and looked around. She was literally on the other side of the world in an apartment worth more than her entire farm, about to live a life that wasn't hers. But she didn't allow herself to be taken by fear. She stood up, unpacked her suitcase with the same practicality she used to organize tools in the field, and took a long bath trying to wash away the fatigue of the trip. When she finished and looked in the mirror, she saw the same person as always, the same Helena who woke up before the sun to care for the plantation. The setting had changed, but she remained herself. In the first few days, Rodrigo let her get used to the new environment without pressuring her. He hired a private tutor who spoke Portuguese to teach her basic French and the social etiquette that would be necessary. The woman, a Brazilian who had lived in Paris for decades, was impressed by the speed with which Helena absorbed information. It wasn't just a good memory, it was a practical intelligence sharpened by years of solving real problems. Helena learned everything with the same attention she dedicated to studying the behavior of plants. She observed patterns, identified the logic behind apparently arbitrary rules, and adapted the knowledge to her own way of being. She didn't try to copy anyone's behavior. She only incorporated what made sense and discarded the rest. The first social event happened 2 weeks after their arrival. a charity dinner with the presence of businessmen, diplomats and people linked to the world of arts. Rodrigo warned her in advance, offering to bring a personal stylist to help choose a dress, but Helena politely declined. She said she knew what was appropriate and would choose it herself. She appeared in the living room that night wearing a simple navy blue dress, without excessive sparkle or unnecessary complications. The cut was perfect, elegant without being ostentatious. She had combed her hair into a low bun, wore discreet earrings, and makeup so light it seemed not to be there at all. The natural beauty Rodrigo had seen that morning among the coffee plants was still present, only framed differently. He was speechless for a moment. He expected her to be nervous, to need encouragement, but Helena simply picked up her small handbag and asked if they were late. There was the same serenity as always, that ability to face the unknown without being intimidated. The dinner was revealing in several ways. Helena drew attention from the moment they entered the hall, not just for her discreet beauty, but for something more subtle, a presence that didn't bow to the environment. While other people seemed constantly worried about impressing or being noticed, she simply existed, observed and absorbed. When someone asked about her origin, she answered with a direct honesty that caught many off guard. She said she came from a coffee farm in the interior of Brazil, that she had worked the land since she was a child, and that she had never left her region until that trip. Some people smiled with condescension, others were genuinely interested, but no one remained indifferent. A French diplomat, fascinated, began to ask questions about sustainable agriculture, traditional cultivation methods, and the relationship between small producers and the international market. Helena answered with surprising authority, explaining complexities he clearly didn't expect her to master. By the end of the conversation, the man was visibly impressed and asked for her contact information for possible future consulting on agricultural projects. Rodrigo observed it all from a distance, seeing her interact with natural ease. She wasn't performing sophistication. She was being exactly who she was, and that had a power he hadn't predicted. People noticed the authenticity, and they either felt threatened by it or were magnetized. There were also uncomfortable moments. A woman with an important last name made veiled comments about how brave it was of Rodrigo to bring someone so exotic to that social circle. Helena listened without changing her expression, simply thanked her for what she interpreted as a compliment to her courage, and continued talking to other people. The woman was disconcerted by the lack of reaction. At the end of the night, when they returned to the apartment, Rodrigo asked how she felt. Helena took off her high-heeled shoes with evident relief and said it was interesting. She wasn't faking. She really found it fascinating to observe that world so different from her own, to identify the power dynamics hidden under the surface of courtesy, and to perceive who was genuine and who was always calculating advantages. Rodrigo laughed, surprised by the shrewd analysis. He asked what she thought of the people she met. Helena was direct. She said some were truly interesting, curious about the world beyond their own bubbles. Others were just bored rich people trying to fill a void with social events. And there were those who saw everything as a competition, measuring human value by last names and bank accounts. Her frankness was refreshing in a way Rodrigo hadn't experienced in years. In that world, everyone spoke in codes, in half-words, in polite insinuations. Helena didn't know how to do that, and surprisingly, she didn't need to. The following weeks established a peculiar routine. During the days while Rodrigo took care of business, Helena explored Paris with the freedom of someone who had no obligations beyond being available for evening events. She walked for hours through the streets, observed people, and visited open-air markets where fresh products vaguely reminded her of the fairs she knew in Minas. She discovered she especially liked the gardens. She spent entire afternoons in the Jardin du Luxembourg, observing how the French cultivated their urban green spaces, so different from the plantations she knew, but equally careful in their relationship with the earth. She began to talk to local gardeners, her French still precarious but sufficient to exchange knowledge about plants. One of them, a white-haired gentleman named Michel, was delighted to discover she had deep knowledge of cultivation. They started an unlikely friendship, meeting regularly to talk about planting techniques, how different soils reacted to different seeds, and the patience necessary to see something grow. Michel had no idea who she was or exactly where she came from. To him, she was just that Brazilian girl, with the hands of someone who had worked the land all her life, who understood real plants and not just theory. These conversations became an anchor for Helena, reminders that not everything in that new world was surface and appearance. Meanwhile, daily life with Rodrigo began to reveal layers that neither of them expected. They had dinner together at the apartment when there were no events, and these simple meals became moments of genuine exchange. He told her about the pressure of maintaining a business empire, about the family expectations that had shaped him since childhood, and about the loneliness of always being surrounded by people but rarely finding a real connection. Helena listened with the same attention she dedicated to everything, asking direct questions that forced him to reflect on things he had always taken for granted. She also shared her own stories, about growing up knowing that the family's survival depended on every harvest, about learning to read the signs of nature even before learning to read books, and about the silent beauty of seeing something you planted finally bear fruit. There was an obvious contrast between their lives, but they also discovered unexpected commonalities. Both knew the weight of responsibility, the loneliness of carrying decisions that affected other people, and the need to be strong even when fatigue set in. It was on one of those nights, after a simple dinner at home, that something shifted subtly between them. They were on the balcony of the apartment, looking at the lights of Paris, when Rodrigo casually mentioned that he had never felt so comfortable with someone. He wasn't trying to seduce her, he was just stating a fact that surprised him. Helena turned to look at him, and for the first time since she arrived, she allowed him to see beyond the careful serenity she maintained. She said she was also beginning to understand why he had made that absurd proposal. It wasn't about having someone beautiful by his side at events. It was about finding someone who saw him as a person, not as a last name or a bank account. Rodrigo felt something tighten in his chest. She was right, although he hadn't consciously realized it when he devised the proposal. He was tired of being seen as a symbol, an opportunity, a trophy. He wanted to be just Rodrigo, with all the doubts and vulnerabilities he hid under the veneer of a successful businessman. They stayed in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who don't need to fill every second with words. And it was in that silence that both began to realize that what was growing between them went beyond the initial agreement. But they didn't speak about it yet. It wasn't time. For now they allowed themselves only that increasingly intimate coexistence, those conversations that were becoming deeper, those looks that lasted a few seconds longer than necessary. Paris continued its eternal rhythm around them, indifferent to the small earthquakes beginning to happen inside that apartment in the 16th arrondissement, where a woman from the countryside and a man from the São Paulo elite discovered that social distance meant much less than they had imagined. The month of May brought spring to Paris, and with it a transformation in the dynamics between Helena and Rodrigo. What started as curiosity was evolving into something deeper. Helena noticed it first, the way he looked at her during dinners, how his fingers brushed hers, how he prolonged conversations. These were clear signs. Rodrigo took longer. He was used to having control over his feelings, but Helena escaped all his categories. She didn't behave like the women he knew. She had no interest in money or status. She didn't play games of seduction. She was simply herself, and that disarmed him. The change happened on a Friday night. They went to an opera, and Rodrigo watched her more than the stage, fascinated by the way she was moved without performing. When they returned, they stayed in the living room talking. Helena mentioned she missed the sounds of the farm. Rodrigo asked if she regretted it. Helena took a moment to answer, said no, but that something was changing inside her, something she wouldn't know how to name. That was when Rodrigo finally admitted he didn't want the 6 months to end, that the idea of Helena returning to Brazil and disappearing had become unbearable, that at some point she had become essential to him. Helena looked him in the eyes, her serenity dissolving. She said softly that she felt the same, that she fought against it every day because it made no sense, but that it was real. Rodrigo approached slowly, giving her time to back away if she wanted. Helena didn't back away. When he finally kissed her, it was with an intensity that surprised both, as if months of restraint had finally found an outlet. She responded with the same intensity, the hands that knew the touch of the earth now exploring his face, his hair, his shoulders. They stayed together that night, and it was different from any experience Rodrigo had ever had. There was no performance, no calculation, just a genuine connection between two people who finally stopped fighting what they felt. Helena was both vulnerable and strong, surrendered yet mistress of herself, and he lost himself completely in that impossible contradiction. In the morning they woke up intertwined, the soft light of Paris coming through the windows. Helena showed no regret or embarrassment, only that same clarity that characterized her. Rodrigo pulled her closer, murmuring against her hair that everything had changed, that he could no longer pretend this was just a temporary arrangement. Helena agreed, but her voice had a note of concern. She asked what would happen when people found out, when his social circle discovered he was seriously involved with someone like her. Rodrigo said it didn't matter, but Helena knew it did. People like him didn't live in isolated bubbles. There were expectations, pressures, and intertwined interests that couldn't simply be ignored, and she was right. In the following days, as the intimacy between them became more evident, reactions began to appear. At the next social event, a charity gala, Helena noticed a change in the way people treated her. Before, she was seen as an interesting curiosity, something exotic but temporary. Now that it was clear Rodrigo was genuinely involved, the masks of courtesy began to fall. Her French socialite, Rodrigo's ex-lover, made a point of approaching Helena during the cocktail hour. With a smile perfectly calibrated to look friendly to distant observers but sharp up close, she began asking questions about how long she planned to stay, if she didn't find Paris too. Complex for someone used to such simple environments, if she really believed she could permanently adapt to that world. Helena answered politely but without bowing. She said Paris was interesting, but that complexity existed everywhere, including in deciding when to plant or harvest to ensure a family's survival. That adaptation was a matter of intelligence and will, not origin. The woman smiled bitterly and walked away, but Helena knew she had made an enemy. Rodrigo noticed the interaction from afar and was furious. He confronted his ex-lover, making it clear that any disrespect toward Helena would be considered disrespect toward him. The woman only laughed, saying he was being naive, that the passion would pass and he would return to normal, that people like Helena didn't belong to that world no matter how hard they tried. But the pressure wasn't just coming from the French social circle. Rodrigo's family in Brazil began to ask questions. Since he was being seen at events with the same woman repeatedly, rumors began to circulate. His mother called, worried, wanting to know who that girl was, where she came from, and what her intentions were. Rodrigo tried to explain, but he quickly realized there was no explanation his family would easily accept. For them, relationships were part of social and business strategies. Marriages united empires, consolidated alliances, and maintained status. The idea that he was genuinely in love with a woman without an important last name, without useful connections, without anything but herself, seemed incomprehensible. Helena listened to these tense conversations, saw the growing stress in Rodrigo, and began to wonder if she was being selfish. Maybe it would be better to end it before it caused irreparable damage to his life. But whenever she thought about going back, about leaving him, something inside her refused. It wasn't financial dependence or fear of returning to her previous life. It was something more fundamental, a connection that seemed larger than both of them. It was during this period of increasing tension that something unexpected happened. Rodrigo had to return to Brazil for a series of urgent meetings, and for the first time since they arrived in Paris, they would be separated for more than a week. Helena would stay at the apartment and he would return as soon as possible. The night before the trip, they made love with a different urgency, as if they were trying to imprint themselves on each other before the separation. Rodrigo said he would be back soon, that she didn't need to worry. Helena just nodded, but there was something in her eyes he couldn't decipher. When she was left alone in the apartment, Helena finally had time to process everything that was happening. She called her family in Brazil, talked to her mother about the farm, about how things were. Everything seemed to be going well. The money Rodrigo had provided was being used wisely. and the improvements on the property were moving forward. But during the conversation, her brother mentioned something casual that made Helena stop. He said people had appeared asking questions about the farm, about the property's history, about old documents. When they asked who they were, they said they were doing historical research on land in the region. It seemed harmless, but something about it bothered Helena. She began to ask her own questions. She called old neighbors, people who knew the history of the region. Gradually, she began to put together pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed. The family farm had a more complex history than she had imagined. In the past, those lands had belonged to a powerful family that had lost everything in obscure circumstances. There were lost documents, old disputes never fully resolved. When Rodrigo called from São Paulo that night, Helena asked him directly if he knew anything about the farm's history before he met her. There was a pause that was much too long on the line. He said they would talk when he returned, that it wasn't a conversation to have over the phone. That answer confirmed the suspicions Helena was beginning to develop. There was something he hadn't told her, something that preceded all the involvement between them. The coincidence of him appearing in that exact region, taking an interest specifically in her, and making that seemingly impulsive proposal, began to look less like coincidence and more like planning. She spent the night awake, turning over memories, re-evaluating every interaction since their first meeting. Had it been genuine, or was there another motive? What did he know that she didn't? Did the farm have some hidden value that justified all that interest? When Rodrigo returned to Paris 3 days later, he found Helena visibly different. Her serenity had been replaced by defensive caution. He tried to hug her, but she pulled away, asking him to explain everything, to tell the complete truth about why he had really sought her out. Rodrigo knew that moment would eventually come. He had hoped to have more time, to have built a more solid foundation before having to reveal everything. But looking at Helena, at the pain and suspicion in her eyes, he realized he had no choice. He began to tell her. He said that when he appeared in the region for that business meeting, it wasn't entirely by chance. His company was surveying agricultural land with potential for sustainable development. The Silva family farm had appeared in the reports, not just for the quality of the coffee, but for other reasons that were still being investigated. Helena felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She asked if it had all been an act from the beginning, if his interest in her was just a means to get to the property. Rodrigo vehemently denied it, saying that when he saw her working that morning, something genuine happened, something that had nothing to do with business or land. But Helena no longer knew what to believe, how to separate truth from convenience when everything seemed so perfectly orchestrated. She said she needed time, that she needed to understand what was happening before making any decision about their future. Rodrigo tried to argue, but she was inflexible. She asked him to give her space, to wait while she processed everything. He reluctantly agreed, respecting her request, even though he felt he was losing something precious. Helena spent the next few days locked in the guest room, making calls to Brazil, researching the history of the farm, trying to piece everything together. She discovered things she never imagined. Her family didn't own those lands by chance. There were old documents suggesting her grandparents had bought the property in questionable circumstances, taking advantage of a family in crisis. But there was more. By deepening her research, she discovered those lands had immense potential value. Not just agricultural, but from natural resources not yet fully explored. And there were people interested in that. People willing to pay fortunes or use questionable methods to gain access. She began to realize she was in the middle of something much larger than an unlikely romance. The issue wasn't just whether Rodrigo had been sincere about his feelings. It was about power, about control of valuable resources, about interests that wouldn't respect feelings or ethics if they stood in the way. That night, when she finally left the room and found Rodrigo in the living room, Helena was no longer the same woman who had arrived in Paris months before. She had been tested by the fire of suspicion and revelation and emerged stronger but also more cautious. She told him they needed to talk about everything, that she would no longer accept half-truths, that if there was a future for them, it would have to be built on complete honesty, no matter how painful it was. Rodrigo agreed, and for the first time since they met, he put all his cards on the table, prepared for the consequences of what would come next. Rodrigo started from the beginning. He said that 3 months before appearing in the region, his company had received a geological report on lands in Minas Gerais. The document pointed to areas with potential for mineral and water resources. The silver farm was over one of those areas. Helena listened in silence. Rodrigo continued, explaining that initially the interest was professional. He planned to investigate, to evaluate possibilities. That's why he had scheduled that meeting. But then he saw her working, and everything changed. The intelligence in every movement, the authenticity, it all hit him viscerally. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quantify on spreadsheets. That was why he returned. And the more he observed her, the more he became convinced he had found something rare. The proposal was born from that confused urgency. Helena finally spoke, her voice controlled but heavy with emotion. She asked if at any point during all that time together, he had thought about using their proximity to eventually convince her to sell the farm or facilitate negotiations. Rodrigo took a moment to answer, and that delay was an answer in itself. He admitted that in the beginning, when it all started, there was a part of him that had thought about it, that he had considered the possibility that the connection between them could eventually make things easier from a business perspective. But he swore that died in the first weeks in Paris, that when he realized what he truly felt for her, the idea of mixing business and feelings became repugnant. Helena stood up, walked to the window, looking out at Paris without really seeing it. She said she believed him, that she felt he was telling the truth, but that she couldn't ignore the fact that, regardless of his intentions, there were people interested in the farm, people who might not have the same scruples. That was when she told him what she had discovered, that in the last few days while she was investigating, she had received strange calls. People presenting themselves as historians, researchers, potential buyers, all asking questions about the property, about her willingness to sell, about what she knew about natural resources in the region. Rodrigo grew tense. He asked who specifically had contacted her. Helena mentioned some names, and one of them made his face harden. Marcelo Tavares, a businessman known for aggressive land acquisition methods, someone with whom Rodrigo had already had professional confrontations in the past. If Tavares was interested in the farm, it meant the information about its potential value had leaked beyond Rodrigo's company. And Tavares wasn't the type who took no for an answer. He used pressure, intimidation, found weak points, and exploited them without mercy. Helena saw the genuine concern on Rodrigo's face and realized that, whatever his flaws, he really cared about what would happen to her and her family. She sat down again, closer to him this time, and asked him to explain exactly what was at stake, what the real value was of those lands she had cultivated for 23 years without knowing they hid something. Rodrigo took his laptop, showed geological maps, technical reports, financial projections. The farm was over a significant underground aquifer, besides having signs of mineral deposits that could be worth millions. They weren't resources that could be exploited easily or without serious environmental consequences. But for someone without scruples, they represented a potential fortune. Helena absorbed it all in silence. It was surreal to think that the land where she learned to walk, where she planted her first coffee plant at 5 years old, where she buried her grandparents, was worth so much money. But she also understood that value wasn't just financial. That land had a history. It had the sweat of generations. It had memories that couldn't be priced. She asked Rodrigo what his company planned to do with the information. He was honest. He said that initially the idea was to make a fair purchase offer to develop the area sustainably, respecting both the people and the environment. His company had a reputation for responsible development, not predatory exploitation, but he admitted that now, with everything that had happened between them, he no longer knew how to proceed. He couldn't ignore that the farm had immense value, but he also couldn't simply make a purchase offer to the woman he loved without it looking like he was using the relationship as a negotiation tool. Helena looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had used the word love explicitly. Rodrigo realized what he had said and didn't back down. He repeated it, this time looking directly into her eyes. He said he loved her, that it hadn't been part of any plan, that it happened despite all logic and calculation. She felt something melt inside her chest, her anger and suspicion competing with the feeling she tried to deny but knew was real. She said softly that she also loved him, but that love didn't solve the practical problems they faced. They needed to find out how to protect the farm, how to deal with people like Tavares, how to ensure her family wouldn't be manipulated or threatened. Rodrigo agreed. He said they needed a strategy, but this time he would be transparent about every step. He proposed that Helena talk to lawyers specialized in property law and natural resources, that she fully understand her options before making any decision. He offered resources and contacts but made it clear the final decisions would be hers. Helena appreciated the approach, but she knew it wouldn't be simple. She needed to return to Brazil, see the situation in person, talk to her family, and understand the real dimension of what they were facing. She told Rodrigo this, and he immediately offered to go with her. She hesitated, but he insisted. He said whether they liked it or not, they were in this together, and that he had resources and knowledge that could help. They decided to travel to Brazil the following week. In the meantime, Rodrigo activated his legal team to start investigating the movements of Tavares and others who might be interested in the property. Helena went back to talking to her family, warning them about the trip and asking them not to sign anything, not to agree to anything until she arrived. It was during these preparations that something unexpected happened. Helena received a call from Michel, the French gardener who had become a friend. He called because he had read a piece of news in a Brazilian newspaper circulating among the Brazilian community in Paris. The news spoke about land disputes in Minas Gerais, specifically mentioning the region where the Silva family farm was located. The article, seemingly innocent, brought distorted information, suggesting the family had obtained the lands in a questionable way in the past, that there was doubtful documentation about the property. It was clearly an attempt to delegitimize the family's ownership, to create a narrative that would facilitate future challenges. Helena showed the article to Rodrigo, who immediately recognized Tavares' tactics. It was a method the businessman frequently used, planting seeds of doubt in public opinion, creating narratives that would justify his future actions, making it look like he was correcting injustices instead of committing new ones. The urgency of the trip to Brazil increased. It was no longer just about understanding the situation. It was about containing damage before it spread. Rodrigo moved up the flights, contacted people in Brazil to start investigating exactly where that news had come from. The night before the trip, Helena was on the balcony of the apartment in Paris, looking at the city that had become unexpectedly familiar in recent months. Rodrigo approached from behind, hugged her around the waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. He asked her if she regretted accepting the initial proposal, leaving the farm to live that adventure. Helena took a moment to answer. She said regret was a complicated word, that if she hadn't come, she never would have discovered what the farm was really worth, never would have prepared to protect it properly. But she also would have avoided all the pain and confusion that came with it. Rodrigo said that as selfish as it was, he couldn't regret it. That meeting her had changed something fundamental in him, that for the first time in years, he felt he was truly living instead of just performing expected roles. Helena turned in his arms, looked at the face that had become so familiar, so important. She said that regardless of what happened when they returned to Brazil, regardless of how they solved or didn't solve all the problems that awaited them, there was one thing she knew for sure: what was between them was real and it was worth fighting for. They kissed with renewed urgency, the awareness that they would face difficult battles in the coming days, making every touch more intense. They made love that night, as if they were recording memories to sustain what was to come, storing strength in each other for the challenges that awaited. The next day, when the plane took off from Paris for São Paulo, both knew they were leaving one phase behind and entering a completely different one. It would no longer be about discovering feelings or navigating social differences. It would be about protecting what mattered, facing real threats, deciding what kind of future they wanted to build and what they were willing to sacrifice for it. Helena looked through the window, seeing Paris shrink below them, and thought of the farm that awaited her. How many times had she dreamed of leaving that place, of seeing the world beyond the plantations? And now, having seen it, having lived in Paris, having experienced luxury and sophistication, she discovered that her heart remained firmly planted in that piece of land in Minas Gerais. But she was no longer the same woman who had left. She now carried knowledge, experience, and resources she didn't have before. And by her side was a man who, despite all the complications and mistakes, genuinely cared about her and what was important to her. Rodrigo held her hand during the entire flight, and in that simple gesture there was a silent promise. Whatever storms came, they would face them together. And this time, with all secrets revealed, with all cards on the table, they would have a real chance to win. Brazil awaited them, with its complex problems and dangerous people, but also with the possibility of transforming what had always been a simple coffee farm into something much larger, something that could change not just the destiny of a family, but of an entire region. The question was whether they would arrive in time to make a difference, or if the forces already mobilized against them would be too strong to fight. They would only know when they stepped back onto Brazilian soil and confronted head-on everything that had been set in motion in the months they were away. Reality hit them as soon as the car entered the dirt road leading to the farm. Helena noticed immediately that something was wrong. There was unusual movement on the neighboring properties, new signs announcing future developments, fences being repositioned in ways that seemed to subtly invade the traditional boundaries of the lands. When they finally arrived at the family home, they found Helena's parents visibly shaken. Her mother hugged her daughter with a strength that revealed months of contained worry. Her father, a man of few words, only nodded to Rodrigo with distant courtesy, clearly suspicious of that stranger who had taken his daughter to another continent. Inside the house, while Rodrigo waited politely in the living room, Helena talked to her parents in the kitchen. She discovered the situation was worse than she had imagined. In the last few weeks, they had received almost daily visits. Representatives of companies, lawyers, even people presenting themselves as government inspectors, all asking questions about the property's documentation, about interest in selling, about future plans for the land. Helena's brother, Lucas, only 19 years old, was particularly agitated. He said some of the visitors had been subtly threatening, suggesting that legal challenges could arise regarding the legitimacy of the land ownership, that it would be easier to sell now, while they still had reasonable market value. Helena felt anger boiling inside her. She recognized the tactics, creating fear, urgency, the feeling that resisting would be worse than yielding. But her family didn't have the resources or knowledge to properly evaluate the threats or defend their rights. They were being manipulated by people who knew exactly how to exploit vulnerabilities. She called Rodrigo into the conversation and asked him to explain everything to her parents with honesty. He did so without hiding his initial involvement in the investigation of the property, but also making it clear that his intentions had completely changed. He offered legal resources, financial support to hire specialists, and everything necessary to protect the family. Helena's father listened in silence, his face hardened by decades of hard work and justified suspicions. When Rodrigo finished, he asked only one direct question. Why should they trust him? Rodrigo could just be using a different approach to reach the same goal as the others. It was Helena who answered. She said she trusted Rodrigo, that she had spent months with him and that she knew his character beyond first impressions. But she also said they weren't asking for blind trust. Any agreement, any action they took would be documented, transparent, with the family having final control over the decisions. Her mother, who observed everything with the sharp attention that only mothers possess, asked another question. She asked if Helena and Rodrigo were truly together, if there was something real between them beyond business and convenience. Helena looked at Rodrigo, and he held her hand in front of the family, answering firmly that yes, he loved their daughter, that he wasn't there out of interest in the land, but out of love for the woman who cultivated it. There was a moment of heavy silence, and then Helena's mother smiled for the first time. She said a mother knows when her daughter is in love, that she had seen it in Helena's eyes during the calls from Paris, in the way she spoke about him, that if Helena trusted him, the family would trust him too. The father took longer to yield, but eventually he nodded in agreement. He said they had fought hard to keep that land, that they wouldn't give it up without a fight, and that if Rodrigo was really on their side, they would need all the help possible. In the following days, they transformed the simple farmhouse into an unlikely operations center. Rodrigo brought specialized lawyers from São Paulo, experts in rural property law and natural resources. Helena organized all the family's historical documentation, searched for old records and talked to older neighbors who remembered how her grandparents had acquired the land decades ago. They discovered that the original purchase had been legitimate, with proper documentation. The previous family really had been in financial difficulty and had sold for a fair price at the time. Attempts to create a narrative that the acquisition was dishonest were purely fabrications. But they also discovered that Marcelo Tavares was not working alone. There was a complex network of interests involved. Local politicians who would receive benefits if certain lands were developed in specific ways, businessmen who had already acquired neighboring properties, betting they could force the sale of the silver farm, even international groups interested in mineral exploration. The pressure increased when a more aggressive article was published, this time in a newspaper with national circulation. It featured old photos of the farm, interviews with people who claimed to have been harmed by the family in the past, and insinuations about environmental irregularities. It was a coordinated defamation campaign. Helena read the article feeling nauseous. They were attacking not just the property, but her family's reputation, the work of generations. She was about to crumble when Rodrigo showed her something his investigators had discovered. They had evidence that the journalist who wrote the articles had financial connections with companies linked to Tavares. They could expose the fraud. But exposing it publicly would mean entering an open media war, dragging everything into the court of public opinion beyond the real courts. Helena would have to be prepared for her entire life to be scrutinized, for her relationship with Rodrigo to be used against her, for them to try to paint her as an opportunist who seduced a rich businessman to protect her own interests. Rodrigo saw the hesitation in her eyes and said she didn't have to do it, that he had the resources to buy the farm for a generous price, well above market value, that he could ensure the family became wealthy, and that he himself would take charge of the responsible development of the area. It would be the easiest, least painful solution. Helena looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. She asked if that was what he really wanted, for her to sell, to solve everything the simplest way. Rodrigo answered honestly that he no longer knew what he wanted other than to protect her, to prevent her from being hurt by all of it. That was when Helena made a decision that would change everything. She said she wouldn't sell. That land wasn't just property or profit potential. It was identity, history, a promise she made to her grandparents when she was still a child. She said she would fight, use every tool available, and if she had to expose everything publicly, she would. But she also said something that surprised Rodrigo. She said that if the resources of the land were eventually to be developed, it would be on her terms, in a way that benefited the local community, preserved what needed to be preserved, and honored what that land represented. That she was willing to consider partnerships, but only if she maintained final control over decisions affecting that place. Rodrigo realized at that moment that Helena was no longer the young woman he had met working silently among the coffee groves. The months in Paris, the exposure to different worlds, the confrontation with her own strength, all of it had transformed something in her. She hadn't lost her essence, but she had gained confidence, vision, and the courage to demand what she deserved. It was at this point that Tavares finally showed his face. He appeared at the farm without warning, driving an imported car accompanied by 2 lawyers. He asked to speak with the owners of the property, and it was Helena who went out to receive him, Rodrigo right behind her. Tavares was a man in his 50s, impeccably cut grey hair, an expensive suit, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He greeted Helena with ill-disguised condescension, calling her girl, and suggesting that perhaps it was better to talk to the men of the family about such complex matters. Helena answered with a firm voice that she was the one who managed that property, that any conversation about the farm would be with her. Tavares looked at Rodrigo, something like recognition and contempt mixed in his gaze. He commented that it was interesting to see how successful businessmen sometimes lost perspective when beautiful women entered the equation. Rodrigo took a step forward, but Helena touched his arm, signaling she could handle it. She asked directly what Tavares wanted. He let the veneer of courtesy drop, explaining he had invested significant resources acquiring land in the region, and that the development of the area depended on having control over key properties, including the silver farm. He offered a generous sum for the land, more than the family would ever see otherwise, but he made it clear that if she refused, he had other methods. He could make their lives impossible, contest documentation, create environmental and tax problems, and do everything to force them to sell eventually for much less. Helena listened to him without showing fear. When he finished, she said calmly that the land was not for sale, not to him, not for any price he could offer, that if he wanted to create problems, he would find that she also had resources, support, and the determination to fight on every necessary front. Tavares laughed, but there was nervousness in the laugh. He looked at Rodrigo, commenting that it was a pity to see an intelligent businessman being manipulated so easily. Rodrigo answered with a cold voice that the only person trying to manipulate anyone there was Tavares, and that underestimating Helena would be a mistake he would regret. The tension was palpable. Tavares realized that direct intimidation wouldn't work and changed tactics. He said he had researched the relationship between Helena and Rodrigo, that it would be a shame if delicate information about exactly how they met reached the media, that stories about businessmen using romance to acquire valuable land made for interesting headlines. It was a clear threat of blackmail. Helena felt anger burn, but she maintained her composure. She said Tavares was welcome to try, that she herself could tell the full story, including all the attempts at manipulation and intimidation he was making, that she had documentation of everything, recordings and evidence that would show exactly what kind of person he was. It was a partial bluff, but it worked. Tavares realized he had lost the advantage, that Helena wasn't the easy target he expected. He said to think carefully, that his offer would remain open for a limited time, and he left with his lawyers in tow. When his car disappeared down the road, Helena finally allowed her legs to tremble. Rodrigo held her and she leaned on him, the fear she hadn't shown during the confrontation finally finding an outlet. But along with the fear, there was also a fierce pride. She had faced an experienced predator and hadn't backed down. That night, while they were planning the next steps with the legal team, they received unexpected news. One of the neighbors who had sold land to Tavares months before sought Helena out. He was regretful, saying he had been pressured and deceived about the real value of the property. He wanted to testify about the methods Tavares had used. He wanted to help prevent the same thing from happening to others. It was the missing piece. With his testimony and the evidence they already had, they could not only defend the farm but expose Tavares' pattern of behavior. They could turn defense into attack. Helena made a decision. She gathered the family and explained everything she had discovered about the value of the land, the threats they faced, and the options they had. She said if they chose to fight, it would be a long and difficult battle, requiring public exposure and changing their lives in unpredictable ways. But she also said that if they won, they would not only protect the farm but could transform it into something larger. They could develop the land's resources sustainably, create opportunities for the entire community, and prove it was possible to grow without destroying, to prosper without exploiting. The family voted. It was unanimous they would fight. Rodrigo observed Helena at that moment, seeing her transformed into a leader, a force that mobilized others, a vision that transcended personal interest. He realized he had fallen in love with the woman he saw working silently in the field, but it was this version of her, powerful and determined, that he had truly fallen in love with. And at that moment, he made his own decision that would surprise everyone. Rodrigo called an urgent meeting with his company's board of directors in São Paulo. Helena didn't know what he planned, only that he had said he needed to resolve some things before they could move forward properly. She stayed at the farm while he traveled, using the time to strengthen legal defenses and document everything that could be useful in the approaching battle. What she didn't know was that Rodrigo was about to make a decision that would completely change the course of his career and life. In the imposing meeting room of the corporate building in São Paulo, before the top executives and members of the family who controlled the Almeida business empire, Rodrigo explained the situation with brutal clarity. He said he had become personally involved in a way that made it impossible to continue any business interest in the region where the silver farm was located, that his relationship with Helena had created an insurmountable conflict of interest. He proposed that the company completely abandon any plans related to those lands, that it sell the reports and information to another organization with a reputation for sustainable development, and that he himself would step away from any future negotiations involving that area. But he went further. He said he was re-evaluating his role in the company as a whole, that the months in Paris, away from the routine he had always known, had shown him he was living a life that wasn't truly his, fulfilling expectations without questioning if they were what he really wanted. He announced he would resign as CEO, maintaining his shareholding, but handing over operational control to other qualified executives. He wanted the freedom to build something new, something that made sense for who he had become, not for who they expected him to be. The room exploded in protests, in arguments about irresponsibility and impulsive decisions. His mother, present at the meeting, accused him of throwing away the family legacy for a romantic whim. Other executives spoke about duty, about commitments to shareholders, about the absurdity of abandoning everything for a woman. Rodrigo listened to it all in silence. When they finished, he answered calmly that he wasn't abandoning anything. He was choosing. That for the first time in his life, he was making a decision based on what he really wanted, not on what he had been programmed to want since childhood. He said he loved Helena, that he respected what she represented, and that he couldn't be with her as long as there was a shadow of doubt about his motivations. That he needed to prove, to her and to himself, that what he felt was genuine and not mixed with business interests. His mother tried one last argument. She asked if Helena was really worth all that, if a girl from the countryside without formal education or important connections justified such an enormous sacrifice. Rodrigo answered that the question revealed exactly the problem, that a person's value was not measured by diplomas or last names, that Helena had more integrity and wisdom than most of the important people he knew. He made it clear the decision was made. He would sign the necessary documents the following week, organize a proper transition, but he would not change his mind. For the first time in 36 years, he was prioritizing what he felt instead of what seemed rationally correct. When he returned to the farm days later, Helena noticed something had changed in him. There was a lightness that hadn't existed before, as if an invisible weight had been removed from his shoulders. He told her everything that had happened in São Paulo, expecting perhaps that she would try to convince him to reconsider, not to give up so much because of her. Instead, Helena hugged him tight and said she understood, that she herself was making a similar choice by deciding to fight for the farm instead of accepting an easier path. That both were choosing authenticity over convenience, truth over appearance. But she also said something that surprised him. She said she had a proposal for him, that if he really wanted to build something new, she had an idea of how they could do it together, in a way that honored both her values and his business experience. She explained her vision, to transform the farm into a model of sustainable development and social responsibility, to use the land's natural resources, but in a way that benefited the entire community, created local jobs, and preserved the environment. To partner with serious sustainable development organizations, bringing in technical expertise but maintaining local control over decisions. Rodrigo could use all his business knowledge to structure a project that was both economically viable and socially responsible. It wouldn't be charity or exploitation. It would be a new model of how development could happen. And if it worked there, it could serve as an example for other communities in similar situations. Helena's vision was ambitious, complex, and challenging, and Rodrigo found himself more excited about that idea than he had been with any business in recent years. It was a real purpose, a tangible impact, a legacy that would be worth more than any amount in a bank account. While they developed the plans, the battle with Tavares continued. With the neighbors' testimony and evidence gathered by the legal team, they filed a formal lawsuit against him, accusing him of intimidation, fraud, and attempted coercion. The story hit the media, and this time the narrative was controlled by them. Investigative journalists began to take an interest in Tavares's pattern of behavior. They discovered the silver farm wasn't an isolated case, that he had used similar tactics in other regions. Authorities began to investigate his business practices. The hunter had become the hunted. Tavares tried to counterattack, hiring a PR firm to paint Helena and Rodrigo as opportunists trying to defame him. But the strategy failed. Helena's authenticity, Rodrigo's courage in resigning from his family empire to be with her, the solid documentation of Tavares's irregularities, all of this created a narrative stronger than anything he could fabricate. In a desperate move, Tavares offered a settlement. He would withdraw all claims on lands in the region and pay compensation to those he had harmed, in exchange for them dropping the criminal charges against him. Helena consulted her family and lawyers. The offer was tempting. It would end the battle quickly. But she refused. She said it wasn't just about protecting their farm, it was about setting a precedent, showing that people like Tavares couldn't continue operating with impunity. She said they would take the process to the end, regardless of how long it took. Rodrigo supported the decision completely. He offered financial resources to sustain the legal battle for as long as necessary. But he also suggested an alternative. Instead of just destroying Tavares, they could offer a path to redemption. If he agreed to testify about corruption schemes involving politicians and other businessmen, if he used his experience to help create stronger legislation protecting small owners, they could consider reducing the charges against him. It was a risky move. Tavares could refuse. He could see it as weakness. But to everyone's surprise, he accepted. Perhaps because he was tired, perhaps because he realized he had more to lose by continuing to fight, or perhaps because he saw in Helena and Rodrigo something missing in his own life, some form of integrity he had lost over the years. With Tavares's cooperation, they managed to expose a much larger network of corruption and land manipulation. The investigation resulted in legislative changes, arrests of corrupt politicians, and stronger protections for rural communities. The silver farm, which had almost been lost, became a symbol of resistance and transformation. 6 months after the return to Brazil, on a sunny October morning, a ceremony took place at the farm. They were officially inaugurating the project they had developed, a partnership between the Silva family, a sustainable development organization, and a group of ethical investors Rodrigo had gathered. The project combined traditional agriculture with the careful exploitation of water resources to benefit the entire region, created a training center for farmers from other areas to learn sustainable techniques, and established a fund for educational development in the local community. Helena was radiant that day, not for the luxury of the event, but for the realization of seeing a vision become reality. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her hair loose in the wind, and there was in her the same serenity Rodrigo had seen that first morning, but tempered now with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. During the ceremony, when it came time to speak, Helena thanked everyone who had supported them, but then turned specifically to Rodrigo. She said in front of everyone gathered that he had entered her life unexpectedly, that in the beginning she hadn't understood his intentions, and that there had been moments of doubt and fear. But she also said he had proven to be the person she needed by her side, someone who respected her strength without feeling diminished, who supported her dreams without trying to control them, and who loved her for who she was instead of trying to mold her into what he thought she should be. Rodrigo felt emotion tighten his throat. When it was his turn to speak, he said that project was more important than any business he had done in his previous life, that Helena had taught him to differentiate value from price, meaning from success, and purpose from ambition. After the ceremony, when the guests had gone and the farm returned to its familiar quiet, Helena and Rodrigo walked together among the coffee plants. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They stopped at a high point from where they could see the entire property. Rodrigo took her hand and intertwined their fingers. He said they had built something important together, but that he wanted to build more. He wanted a whole life by her side. He wanted to wake up every morning seeing her, and he wanted to face all future challenges, knowing they would be together. He knelt right there in the earth she loved so much and asked if she would marry him. He didn't have an extravagant ring prepared, just a small, simple ring that had belonged to her grandmother, which he had borrowed from Helena's mother days before. Helena pulled him back up, her eyes welling with tears. She said yes, it would always be yes, that he had entered her life when she least expected it, and transformed everything in ways she never imagined possible, that she loved him not for what he had or could offer, but for who he was when all the layers of performance and expectation were removed. They kissed as the sun finished setting over the farm, over the land they had almost lost, and that would now be the foundation for the future they would build together. And in that kiss was the promise of everything yet to come, of the challenges they would face, and of the love they would cultivate with the same care Helena had always dedicated to that plantation. Months later, they married in a simple ceremony at the farm, mixing different traditions and worlds. Rodrigo's mother, who had opposed it so much, cried during the ceremony, finally understanding that her son hadn't lost anything. He had gained everything that mattered. They built a new house on the property, dividing their time between the farm and occasional trips. Rodrigo didn't miss the power he had left behind. He found satisfaction in work with a real impact. Helena continued to be the soul of the project, connecting tradition and innovation. They had a son 2 years later, a boy who would grow up knowing both plantations and museums, learning to value both the land and knowledge, raised by parents who proved that true love knows no social barriers. Sometimes on quiet nights, they sat on the porch looking at the stars over the farm. They talked about the unlikely coincidences that brought them together and the choices they made. The farm prospered, and the social project grew. But above all, two hearts that found an unlikely connection proved that true love was about choosing to build a future together, respecting different pasts. In that piece of land in Minas Gerais, where coffee still grew following ancestral rhythms, where a woman from the fields and a man from the elite became simply Helena and Rodrigo, it was proven that social distance means less than the depth of connection. The millionaire had found something money couldn't buy. The farmer had discovered she belonged to larger worlds, and together they built a reality where love was the foundation on which everything was raised, where a happy ending was a real achievement, earned by the courage of both. The story that began with an observation one morning among coffee groves continued with two hearts beating in sync, two lives intertwined, and two worlds merged, creating something new and beautiful. And the coffee continued to grow, a witness to a love that had flourished against the